Good afternoon. My name is George Barakis. I'm the president and co-founder of Young Conservatives for Carbon Dividends, YCCD for short. I want to start by saying a big thank you to the entire team at the Volo Foundation, especially Nicole, for putting together this great week of presentations and talks that's highlighting some of the great work that's going on in climate in Florida and across the country, and the great organizations that are doing this work. I'm really grateful to have been asked to be a part of this and to talk about something that's very important to me, which is engaging conservative voices in the climate conversation and working to make climate the bipartisan issue that it not only deserves to be, but needs to be if we're going to make progress on this issue in the coming decades. So as I mentioned, I'm the president of YCCD. We're a national advocacy organization that mobilizes young right-of-center voters to support ambitious solutions to the climate challenge, like carbon pricing and carbon dividends. And we believe that this policy framework is vital if we're going to address this challenge at the scale and speed that we must. We were launched in 2019. And we're co-founded by 30 of the top college Republican leaders from across America, as you can see here. And at the time, this coalition of young conservative leaders was the first time that so many young voices of influence from within the Republican Party came out to publicly support a concrete and ambitious climate policy, let alone one that includes a price on carbon. And this was, sort of a historic moment in that sense. And you can see that reflected in some of the press coverage that we got at the time. So at YCCD, we work with young conservative leaders across the country to educate them about the importance of bipartisanship in climate change and the importance of conservative climate leadership, of Republicans leading on climate change. And we get more conservative voices into the climate conversation that are advocating for policies like carbon pricing that we need to address this challenge. So today I'm going to talk about three sort of broad and related topics. First, I'm going to give a sort of short synopsis of the history of environmental leadership in the Republican Party from conservatives. Second, I'm going to go into a little bit more depth about what carbon dividends actually is, what is this policy that we support, and why we think it should be the cornerstone of America's climate strategy. And last but not least, I'm going to turn back to today and discuss the work that YCCD is doing, why we think it's so important, and how it fits into the broader climate moment that we're in here in 2022. So many are sometimes surprised to find out that there's actually a long and I would say honorable legacy of Republican and conservative engagement on climate and environmental issues throughout American history, especially in the 20th century. As former Secretary of State George Shultz put it well, I think, quote, all of the major actions in the conservation area have taken place under the leadership of Republican presidents. We'll talk about a few of those Republican presidents. You look at Teddy Roosevelt, conservationist, who really founded the modern conservation movement, which still exists today, and also established America's national park systems, which, are really one of the great wonders and beauties of this country. You go later into the 20th century, President Richard Nixon, who founded the EPA. Yes, a Republican president founded the Environmental Protection Agency. Later on in the 1980s, President Ronald Reagan, who helped shepherd through the Montreal Protocol, which is widely considered one of the greatest environmental triumphs of the 20th century. And soon after that, President George H.W. Bush, who was confronted with the crisis of acid rain, and through a market-based pollution pricing system, was able to address that problem effectively and efficiently. So there is a long history of engagement from Republicans and conservatives on these issues. And part of what we feel at YCCD is that one of our tasks is to continue that long legacy of leadership with solutions that we need today to address this challenge here in 2022. And, going back to the acid rain solution for a second, this was shepherded in by two people who are actually very important with regards to carbon dividends as well, James A. Baker III and the late George Shultz, who actually authored the Baker-Shultz carbon dividends plan, which we support, which takes me to my next topic, where we'll talk a little bit about this policy. So for many, these two men may not need much introduction. James Baker and George Shultz, two of the great Republican statesmen in all of American history and certainly in the 20th century, both have incredible and substantial resumes. You can see both served multiple presidents. James Baker as Secretary of State for President Bush, Secretary of the Treasury for President Reagan, a Chief of Staff for both men, veteran of many campaigns, and also a United States Marine. And similarly, George Shultz, Secretary of State for President Reagan, Secretary of the Treasury under President Nixon, a number of other roles, and also a notable American businessman and economist. And, these men are really luminaries and are universally revered across the political spectrum, as you can see here in some of these quotes. So in the mid-2010s, Baker and Shultz came together to co-author with a number of other leaders the Baker-Shultz Carbon Dividends Plan, which is a market-based framework for reducing carbon emissions and also growing the economy, protecting American workers, and compelling the rest of the world to act on climate change as well. And the genesis of this plan was really to put forward a market-based solution rooted in conservative principles that conservatives could support. And some of you might be familiar with this, but in case you're not, there's sort of four broad pillars to the carbon dividends framework. The first is a gradually rising economy-wide price on carbon, which would, in its most basic form, charge the biggest polluters in this country for their carbon emissions and send the strongest possible market signal to accelerate the innovation and deployment of clean energy across the economy. The second pillar is the carbon dividend pillar, which is a dollar-for-dollar rebate of all of the revenue from the price on carbon to the American taxpayer in the form of a quarterly dividend payment. So think about the way that many folks got COVID checks during the pandemic. This is sort of a similar thing, a direct check back to American families, which would be around $2,000 a year, according to a Treasury study. And this would help ensure that the vast majority of Americans actually come out financially ahead from solving climate change and reducing carbon emissions, which is very important. And in addition, it makes the policy revenue neutral, also very important for conservatives. The third pillar is a rollback of redundant government regulations that sort of become obsolete once you have a national price on carbon implemented. And what this does is it ensures that businesses get a chance to compete and that the market forces lead the way forward with innovation and entrepreneurship, which we need to address this challenge. And fourth, last but not least, a border carbon adjustment, which would hold other countries accountable for their own carbon emissions by charging a carbon fee at our border. About 15 to 20% of global emissions come from the United States. But the other 85% come from around the globe. And so any climate policy also needs to address those global emissions and ensure that America can be in the driver's seat of climate policy and be compelling other countries to reduce emissions and engage in serious climate policy making as well. And this would also help to protect American jobs by ensuring we're not outsourcing manufacturing of clean energy technology and ensure that U.S. businesses can compete in the global market when it comes to manufacturing that clean energy technology. So this framework is supported by a number of uber impressive people and stakeholders, which I'm going to talk about now. it really has an incredibly broad coalition of support behind it. First, and perhaps most importantly, from economists who've studied this issue and know about, what are the most efficient climate solutions. In 2019, 3,500 economists from around the country came together to sign the Economist Statement on Carbon Dividends, which endorsed this policy framework. And it's a bipartisan group, 3,500 economists, including 45 Nobel Prize-winning economists, every former chair that's alive of the Federal Reserve, every living chair of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, including all the chief economic advisors for Republican presidents, and a number of Treasury secretaries. And this was, again, a historic statement that ran in the Wall Street Journal as an op-ed in the beginning of 2019. And this, I'll just mention, highlights that there's, the near unanimity among folks in the economics community who've studied this issue and who study, policies to address climate change, that a price on carbon is the most efficient way to go if you want to reduce carbon emissions at the scale and speed we need. So, as I mentioned, signed by former Fed chairs, former chairs of the President's Chief of Economic Advisory Council, and Nobel Prize-winning economists. And you can see that, just to illustrate that this group of economists is really a bipartisan group. Folks who served President George H.W. Bush, folks who served President Obama. And in addition to people in the economics community, there's also, as I mentioned, an incredibly broad coalition behind this climate policy. Many of the major editorial boards from around the country, from publications around the country, have endorsed this policy framework. It's backed by some of the largest and most respected environmental organizations in the world, including the World Wildlife Fund, in the World Resources Institute. And crucially, it's also backed by some of the leading businesses in the country and in the world across multiple industries. So from Microsoft to Johnson & Johnson, AT&T, Exelon, energy companies, technology companies, many companies across many industries support this plan. You can also see a number of other important sort of VIPs, from Larry Summers to Ray Dalio, founder of Bridgewater Associates, Jim Mattis, one of the great military leaders, to Janet Yellen, the current chairwoman of the Fed. Just going to go through some specific quotes here. Economist Greg Mankiw, head of the economics department at Harvard, someone who served President George H.W. Bush, just emphasizing there's a complete consensus among economists that a price on carbon is what we need to do to reduce climate emissions. Lindsey Graham, a Republican senator, some might be surprised to find out that he's a big supporter of a price on carbon as a Republican senator. Rex Tillerson, who served President Trump and was also the CEO of ExxonMobil, saying that a carbon pollution tax is the most efficient means of reflecting the cost of carbon in all economic decisions. All the way up to Wall Street, legendary trader Bob Litterman, emphasizing the need to price in climate risk in investment decisions through a price on carbon. And part of the reason why there's such a broad coalition around this idea of carbon pricing and of carbon dividends is because this policy would be incredibly effective and powerful at reducing carbon emissions, which fundamentally is the main thing we need to do to address the challenge before us. You can see here that a plan like the Baker-Schultz plan would secure 3 times the emissions reductions of all the executive regulations that were shepherded through in the Obama administration, and would actually allow us to exceed our commitment under the Paris Accord and to achieve net zero emissions easily by 2050, while also being able to decarbonize sort of harder to decarbonize sectors across the economy. So, in many ways, the carbon dividends policy really is a panacea. It reduces emissions, and as George Schultz said here, would also strengthen our economy, help working class Americans, and promote national security. Another quote here by James Baker. So you can get a sense that of the unique sort of appeal of this sort of policy. Not only does it have this broad base of support from economists, from businesses, from NGO stakeholders, this support is also bipartisan, which in today's climate is actually quite rare for a climate solution. And given just how effective a solution like this would be at addressing the challenge before us, we think that this demonstrates the sort of unique appeal of a market-based solution, and underscores why this solution ought to be the cornerstone of America's climate strategy. So I'd like to talk a little bit about YCCD's work now, and also just this sort of new movement of young conservatives around climate change. And I think I'll start by taking you back to when I was a college Republican at Tufts University in Boston, my alma mater. Around 2017, 2018, as the head of a college Republican chapter, one of the issues I was starting to hear a lot about from our members was climate change. With a lot of increasing climate impacts and leaders in the Democratic Party really starting to talk about this more vocally, I think there was a sense that Republicans were sort of falling behind in the conversation, and that not having a seat at the table in the policy discussion would be damaging for the party politically. And so when I talked to other college Republican leaders, from around the country, I was also surprised to be hearing the same thing. There was this sort of similar desire for the GOP to coalesce around a national climate strategy. And on the national level, with regards to the party, this just wasn't happening. And so these were the conversations that sort of later led to the founding of YCCD. And what me and many other young Republican leaders believed then, and continue to believe now, is that market-based mechanisms and policies are probably the best way that we have to address the climate challenge before us. And that's why we chose the Baker-Schultz plan to coalesce around, not only because it was authored by two of the great Republican elder statesmen in history, but also that it is rooted in conservative principles and has this broad-based support, and would actually be remarkably effective at solving the climate challenge and also protecting our economy and American workers. So, in the mid-2010s, 2015, 2016, 2017, there's really been a broader shift going on in the Republican Party as it relates to climate issues. There's sort of started to be a recognition among party leaders that not addressing this issue in a serious and pragmatic and common sense way, would lead to electoral peril, in essence, for the Republican Party. And you could see that reflected in two statements here by two leaders in the Republican Party. The leader of the House Republicans, Kevin McCarthy, who said that the GOP risks losing an entire generation of voters if we don't address the climate challenge effectively. And Senator Mike Braun, who's now the co-chair of the Bipartisan Senate Climate Solutions Caucus, who, also cited young conservatives as a chief motivator for his desire to address climate change in his position as co-chair of that committee. And you can see here, Frank Luntz, the famed GOP pollster, in 2019 had done some polling and actually sent a memo to every Republican congressional office warning that, quote, climate is a GOP vulnerability and a GOP opportunity. So highlighting that while, at that point, there was not a lot of serious conversation going on in the Republican Party about climate policy making, that putting forward a plan like the Baker-Schultz plan, a market-based plan that has broad-based support and that would actually address the challenge, is a major GOP political opportunity to secure the votes of the younger generation. And here's actually just an interesting piece in NPR that YCCD was featured in, which sort of described young Republicans who are working on climate as, quote, light years ahead of their elders, older GOP voters. So the crux of YCCD's work is to build support among young conservatives across America for carbon dividends, for market-based climate policies and climate action. We do this in a number of ways. We visit college campuses, a lot of college campuses. We speak to a lot of college students, as well as other clubs and groups, from economics clubs to debate clubs. We speak to high schoolers, to young Republicans. Anywhere we can go and find young right-of-center climate advocates, we go to those spaces to help build our coalition. You can see some pictures here from our talks and presentations we've given on campuses in Florida, and in front of various groups in Florida. And one thing I'll just note is that, among young Republicans in Florida, there is, we find a near universal recognition that this is an issue which needs to be taken head on, and that Republicans need to come to the table with a leadership stance and a policy that not only would address the challenge, but would protect the economy and American workers and ensure that we're, creating the jobs in the clean energy economy of the future. We're also always getting published in Florida's media outlets. You can see, to help get the Republican sort of climate message that we're championing out into the public, you can see some of the pieces that we've published here. We have meetings with members of Congress and other, leaders across Florida. You can see we had a meeting with Miami Mayor Francis Suarez, who is a great leader on this issue for the city of Miami and very forward in discussing climate. We've also met with a number of other Florida's representatives, and you can see some of those reflected here. And in these meetings, we help educate members of Congress and their staff about policies like carbon pricing, and also showcase the growing young conservative support for these ideas in their districts. So that's sort of the crux of YCCD's work. Looking forward, as I get ready to wrap up here, I want to touch on a few final points, mainly centered around why I believe and why we at YCCD believe that this work of getting more right-of-center voters and voices engaged in the climate conversation is so important, especially for the moment that we're in now. Climate change must be a bipartisan issue because its effects fundamentally don't and will not discriminate based on party or ideology. This is an issue which affects and will continue to affect in the future all of our communities. Just look at the past year alone, the wildfires in the west of the United States, the issues with grid reliability, energy grid reliability in Texas and California because of extreme temperatures on both sides, cold and hot. And most recently, just this week in Florida, this heartbreaking hurricane, which is, afflicting so much pain and destruction on communities across the state. These impacts, are only going to grow in the years ahead and decades ahead. And, not only are they serious, extreme weather events, but they're also incredibly costly. Some analyses show that, specific hurricanes like Hurricane Ian can cost anywhere from 60 to many hundreds of billions of dollars, highlighting, just why it's so important that we need to be working towards consensus nationally on the climate challenge. And unfortunately, in recent decades, the Republican Party, as I mentioned, has sort of taken a back seat when it comes to these issues. And I believe has ceded a lot of the conversation around climate policy to Democrats. And this has contributed to the misbranding of climate as an exclusively liberal issue, and couldn't be further from the truth. And we at YCCD are trying to really build up that apparatus of conservatives who are also, addressing climate seriously. Just to sort of get at also this moment that we're in, recently, as many of you know, the Inflation Reduction Act passed, which is no doubt a historic investment in the economy of the future that will help increase the deployment and development of clean energy across the country. But this bill was also passed with Democratic votes only and had to be significantly watered down just to pass through the Senate. And on top of that, when you look at the emissions reductions that the bill can actually achieve, while we do make progress with it, it's not alone enough to get us to our goals in 2030 and in 2050. So to me, it's clearer now than ever that if we're going to be able to pass more climate policies, the additional policies that we need to continue making progress on this issue and get us to our emissions reduction goals for 2030 and 2050, we're going to need to have support from the Republican Party, and we're going to need the two parties to come together and form a consensus. And at YCCD, we're working really hard to make that support from the Republican Party a reality and to elevate what we believe is the best solution, the carbon dividends framework, to the forefront of our national climate conversation. As you saw before, no solution has as broad support as the carbon dividends policy, and no solution would be more powerful in reducing carbon emissions and addressing this challenge. So carbon pricing is really super important if we're to make progress this decade and beyond on climate change. And with bipartisan support, making this progress happen is absolutely within the realm of the possible. We believe that, more strongly now than ever. So I want to thank everyone for listening to this talk today, and again to the Volo Foundation for putting together an amazing program of events this week. If anyone wants to learn more about YCCD and our work, you can visit the link here, yccdaction.org. And you'll also be able to contact us there if you have any other questions. So I just want to say thank you again. Enjoy the rest of the week and be well. Thank you.